I discovered the microphone wasn't working, I was just going to tell you we're going to delay the start of this morning's sessions by a couple of minutes to let people come in from coffee. Officially good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the third day of the conference. We've got a very exciting day for you today. We're starting with our first session on enabling next generation trade in renewable energy value chains. Later this morning, we're going to have a session on infrastructure for sustainable fuels. And this afternoon, we've got our closing ceremony, a big debate about structural innovation. So let me kick off with a thank you to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, otherwise known as the OECD, because they are IRENA's partner for this morning's session. This session is to provide a platform to explore innovative uses of trade policy and new case studies from multilateral, regional and bilateral initiatives aiming to advance international markets for renewable energy and energy-related commodities, which is a hot topic at the moment, obviously with a particular focus on hydrogen, renewable hydrogen and its derivatives. So we're going to hear from new technology and project developers on the practical and policy considerations that shape the tradability of different renewable-based energy vectors across a range of international contexts. So we're going to start out this morning with a couple of scene-setting presentations. So first of all, I would like to ask Ann-Kathrin Lipponer to come to the stage. She's the Associate Program Officer at IRENA, and she's going to give a quick overview on international trade enabling the energy transition.
Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure also to welcome you to our trade session today. And I also would like to thank the OECD and Deger in particular for joining us today and for organizing another hydrogen session at Innovation Week. The last one was so successful, we decided we have to do it again. So good morning. And it is my pleasure to set the scene a little bit with our work on hydrogen trade. We have quite a history in IRENA to look into trade for renewable energies, and particularly also on hydrogen. Before we deep dive into hydrogen, I would like to ask ourselves, why are we looking into trade specifically? So our session is called Enabling Next Generation of Trade, or we can also ask the question, how does the energy transition change how we trade energy? Because it does. We do not only look into how we produce energy in a different way when we talk about the energy transition, and also we do not only talk about how we consume energy differently in the energy transition, we also need to look like how it does change our trade patterns. Because the energy transition actually allows us to have different trade patterns in the energy sector, and it also allows us to have new players in the game. Here you have a general overview about what does it mean to have new trade patterns, because yes, we talk today about hydrogen because it has a specific role in how we shape international markets in the energy transition, but it is not only about the products hydrogen and hydrogen-derived commodities. So what you can see here is just some examples about what we could potentially trade or already trading in the energy transition. So it does also refer to renewable energy-related goods and technologies, and that goes from critical materials, from components, from equipment that we need to trade, and not only the end product in itself. It does also refer to electricity trade and cross-border electricity trade. We had quite an extensive session on that on Wednesday, where we discussed how electricity trade and cross-border electricity trade can help to make national grids more resilient, more efficient, in order to even out some intermittent renewable energy production and feeding in the grid. So I also recommend to look into the summary of that. And then we have our focus of today, which is trade and renewable produced fuels. We always speak about hydrogen, but in fact we mostly talk about hydrogen-derived commodities such as green ammonia and methanol. And what is really important, and that is one thing we really need to think about when we talk about the energy transition in itself, we will have new value chains, and we need to make sure that they are not only sustainable, but they are also resilient and cost competitive in order to really make the infrastructure happening in the energy transition that we need to achieve the tripling pledge. We are very, very happy we have a long-standing cooperation with the WTO, where we teamed up in order to bring both aspects together. Our expertise on energy transition and renewable technologies, and of course the expertise of WTO on trade policy, and really bring those two things together. We did that already previously on solar, but we also now looked into international hydrogen trade. And also, we had last year one report that looks more into the derivative commodities. We realized our member countries had a great interest in establishing international markets for hydrogen and commodities, and also what does it mean for trade. So we did the first one on looking into the current state of these markets, how do they look today and how might they look tomorrow, and also try to develop some recommendations for policymakers to use trade in advancing hydrogen deployment. And in 2024, we focused on 3 aspects, on 3 key enablers, how to make that happen specifically for hydrogen-derived commodity trade. We looked into institutional, social, and infrastructure enablers. Here you can see our map that we used to produce in order to see how trade patterns can play out. You can see here that we estimated that around 1/4 of hydrogen demand would be traded internationally, so it's a minor part of it. And most of it will not be in hydrogen in itself, but in derived commodities, mostly ammonia. One other point that we really need to make when we talk about international trade is that it's not only the product in itself. Here you can see the example of hydrogen, and also it applies to commodities, where you can see it is not only the product, but it's also the equipment, and we are talking about services as well. So it's more complex when we talk about trade than just thinking bring in one product from A to B. We really need to consider the full value chain. Here you can see our latest report on that, and really our key enablers, where we looked into the infrastructure, institutional and social aspects, because when we speak about international value chains, it's important to also look on the impact on the local level. So yes, we need infrastructure, that is very important. We need new infrastructure, and that is a challenge in itself. We need to make sure that the institutional framework is there. That means developing the standards, developing the certification in order to make those products really sustainable and transparent, what we are trading here. That is super important. But we also need to really have a realistic view on what does it mean on the social level. How many jobs? What kind of jobs will there be? How sustainable are those jobs, and what opportunities actually exist, and how can you maximize that on the local level? Yesterday we also had one session on local value chains and skills needed for that. I also recommend that. Today we focus more on the international value chains, and we would like to discuss how we actually can think in a new way about trade, what is needed, what kind of projects do exist in order to really max out our opportunities that we do have in this sphere. So I wish you a lot of fun. Thank you to all the speakers already, and that's it from me.
Thank you. Next up to the stage is Deger Saygin, who's the Industry Programme Lead at the OECD, who leads the Industry Decarbonisation Programme.
Thank you very much. And I think the numbers in the previous presentation from IRENA was speaking for themselves. So there is in the context of hydrogen trade is obviously one of the key points. And from our work at the OECD and the IEA, there's a few numbers that I also want to share with you in addition to what you've seen. So by the end of this decade, in terms of million tons of hydrogen equivalent, the trade and related projects in the pipeline is more than 15 million tons per year. And by the end of 2040, that is reaching nearly to 30 million tons. Obviously, these projects, etc., are in various stages of deployment, mainly in early stage and feasibility study. But what comes out of this is that a majority of this is in the form of ammonia. So that's something to highlight, and you heard that also in the previous presentation from my colleagues at IRENA. There's a few aspects, and we'll talk about that in a second in the panel, that is critical in the context of this trade, whether in the form of ammonia or not. Standards and certification, I think the previous work of IRENA has covered that in much detail. There's an energy security aspect, there's the health and safety aspect, which is not too much discussed, but it's important to highlight. Then there's the sustainable development impact aspect, and I would like to ask a few things to the panelists later about that. How do you create benefits for the exporting and importing countries? And obviously the critical material use aspect. So in the context of trade, obviously technology is key, etc. But there's also other issues to consider. Now, at the heart of all of this, whether production, consumption, trade, there is one thing that comes out, and that is financing. And here, together with the World Bank, so Dolf and his team, we've been working over the past 2 years in trying to unfold what financing and de-risking mean for hydrogen sector globally, but mainly with a focus on the emerging market and developing economies. And in that context, over these 2 years, we've published 2 joint reports. In the first one, as you might know, we looked at the financing, and also we looked at the, let's say, what are the problems in the hydrogen sector in terms of risks. And we've conducted a survey across project developers, financiers, and so on. And what came out, and this has been, I think, overly discussed in many panels, discussions in the past 1.5, 2 years, is the offtake. I'm sure that we'll also touch upon that in a minute during the panel. But there's actually beyond the offtake, we need to understand also what other risks are there. The political, regulatory risks, permitting compliance, macroeconomic, so that's the conditions of the country in terms of economics, and so on and so forth. And offtake is often, defined in one word, but that comes also in additional aspects. As we outlined here, it's about the price uncertainty, it's about the demand uncertainty, it's about the credibility of the offtaker. So there are different dimensions to that. And offtake is not just, whether there's a buyer, consumer, it's also coming with different angles that need to be understood and overcome. So in this complexity of the risks, in the second joint report of the OECD and IRENA, we've looked into how do you overcome these risks, the de-risking aspects. And at the World Bank, the colleagues are looking into this in much more detail. But what we've done in a second survey is to map out all the different de-risking instruments that are available to overcome these risks. And to overcome the offtake-related risk, you see on the top, there is the uncertainty in the demand, and there is the uncertainty in the price. There are, with the dark green shades, you see according to the survey results, two main instruments coming forward. One is offtake guarantees, and the other one is contract for difference. And in terms of the other risks, whether it's a counter risk, interest and exchange rate related risks, so this is actually a very important one in the context of many emerging market and developing economies. Credit defaults, swaps, foreign currency guarantees are becoming possible solutions. I understand, and maybe Dolf will mention that during the panel, the World Bank colleagues are looking into these in a deep dive approach to understand how these can be further developed. And finally, there is, as you see, let's say a menu of options in terms of de-risking instruments. And this is really promising development in the context of the clean hydrogen sector, but it's also important to understand where we use these de-risking instruments. Because across the value chain, it is important to understand where risks and what type of risks are present and apply these de-risking instruments to that specific risk in a targeted way. Obviously, these de-risking instruments also come with their, let's say, own cost, own challenge of implementation, and we want to use them in the most effective way. So that is a key point to keep in mind. It's not just applying everything all together. So it's project by project basis, country by country basis. And they all need to be combined with other types of enabling conditions. So that's another, I think, important point to mention. In the context of successful projects, and I'm sure for those of you who are following, you see that quite commonly, public-private partnerships are key. And finally, in the context of financing, de-risking, there is a huge amount of organizations, institutes looking into that. Especially a lot of banks are now expanding their portfolios in this front. So it's also important to understand how all this can be coordinated, like, for instance, the World Bank's initiative on the 10 gigawatt lighthouse. So these are also important steps forward to use the financing and de-risking instruments and so on in the most effective way for clean hydrogen sector development. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think in the panel we'll be discussing in more detail.
Sorry about the little confusion. Deger is going to be moderating the panel and introducing the speakers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. We have three panelists. I think you know all of them, and they're on the screen. First of all, Eleanor Webster. She's the head of the Secretariat of the Mission Innovation. Mr. Frank Wouters, he's the director of the MEDGAM network. And Mr. Dolf Gielen, who's the global lead for the hydrogen program at the World Bank. So please come on stage. Thank you very much for joining us. We have, I think, about 20 minutes, I suppose, or 25 minutes. Okay. Okay. Maybe I start immediately because I mentioned offtake and I challenged that topic a little bit. And although it has been discussed very much, if I may ask Dolf if, to start with 35. Okay, that's even better. Thank you so much. So to start with the offtake related issues, I mean, what do you see as a key limitation? Obviously, it's a solution, but in the existing offtake agreements from across different projects, what are the key limitations that you see? I think that's one thing we would like to understand a bit better. And also, you know, what needs to be done in terms of solutions to overcome those limitations, also from a perspective of financing and de-risking.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. And before answering that, let me say it's a great pleasure to be here at this Innovation Week. The question around offtake, of course, at its core is a question about price, right? If the clean hydrogen were cheaper than gray hydrogen, we wouldn't have an offtake problem. There would be a market, but that is not the case today. So it's a question about who pays the premium. And there are certain markets where, first of all, the price is not everywhere the same. So to give you an example, there's a number of ammonium nitrate plants in the interior of South America. The fertilizer prices there are higher because of transportation cost. And project developers think they can produce the renewable product at more or less the same price as the conventional product. So where that is the case, you have less of an offtake problem. And we are discussing with them, and one of the ideas in that context is, well, can't you do kind of a price guarantee mechanism? So at least there is a floor price, because that will unlock the financing for these type of projects. Then you have the majority of the markets where the green product is a lot more expensive than the conventional product. So then the question is, who is willing to pay such premium? You see now that there's high hopes around the shipping sector, with a decision to be made in October by the IMO, but the proposal on the table is ambitious. That would create a financial incentive to consider such clean fuels, such as ammonia and methanol. But there you see that for example, for methanol, there's the competition of the biomethanol right now, and the earlier movers are more moving into biomethanol than into the renewable methanol right now. But still, it's longer term. We see also some investments of shipping companies in ammonia production. For example, what CMB Tech is doing in Namibia for their own shipping route. So there are a few offtake contracts. They are still relatively scarce. They have a duration of somewhere between 7 and 15 years. So while the project lifespan is maybe 25 years. So there's already a question, how do you manage that? If you do project financing, it may impact your debt equity ratio. It means you need more equity in the project if you need to recover the full debt servicing during the period of that contract. The question of whether you can do longer offtake contracts is a bit of a question mark. There's also a perspective of, well, then you're banking on the solidity of the company that signs the offtake contract. So there are parties that say, well, I don't care if you have a 15-year offtake contract or a 30-year offtake contract, because anything beyond 15 years is anyway speculative. So one of the ideas we have been asked to look into is, can't you kind of guarantee a floor price beyond the existing offtake contracts? But again, no. So far, to my knowledge, no developments in that direction. So my point is, there are different aspects to these offtake contracts. There are also different ways people ask for guarantees. So parties come and say, oh, can't a development bank guarantee volume and price offtake? I think the short answer is no. Then there's the question, well, can't you guarantee a floor price? I think the answer there is, we can look into it. And then there's the question, well, can't you guarantee kind of a floor price beyond the existing offtake contracts? And again, interesting idea, but I haven't seen anything of that nature yet. So let me stop there.
I think this is very helpful also to understand a little bit how these offtake contracts are working so far. And maybe we can continue, I mean, since we're talking about the trade, from the export angle for those who are into these offtake contracts, but what's happening on the export side. Frank, if I may turn to you on that one. How do you see the progress so far in the projects that are export-oriented, but also maybe your views on the short to medium term, also in view of what Dolf has mentioned?
Yeah, thanks. And maybe for those of you that don't know the MedGem network, we get some money from the European Commission to work with countries of the southern Mediterranean neighborhood. That's the European view of things. So it entails Mauritania all the way to Lebanon. And we work, the GEM stands for Green Electricity and Molecules. And since most countries pretty well understand renewables, the focus is really on hydrogen and derivatives. By the way, interestingly, yesterday I was at the EU Sustainable Energy Week at a hydrogen session, and they did a poll of the audience. What are the, let's say, the challenges going forward in the short term? And the offtake was actually the last thing that people mentioned. So I'm sure your targeted audience for your poll was probably people that are into the business. But the people in the audience, they ranked regulatory uncertainty, infrastructure, and the lack of markets, higher than the lack of offtakes. But that is, perhaps, an interesting data point to consider. Now the question is, because a lot of the countries in the southern Mediterranean, and also in the Gulf, they have, of course, they have low cost and available land. They have a great resource, so the potential to produce these molecules at lower cost, and then even if you add the transport cost, it might still be competitive with Europe. So they're looking at, most of them are actually looking at Europe as a market because it's the closest area that has decided to actually buy. So there's a lot of initiatives, and you may know the mechanisms that Europe is deploying. You have the European Hydrogen Bank, but also H2 Global, which is a private German initiative that is actually a double auction. So they auction both the offtake, so they pool offtake, and then they basically ask people to bid for supply, and then they match that. So they sit in between. The European Hydrogen Bank is slightly different in approach. First of all, it's so far been only intra or inter-European, so it's only European supply and offtake, and then the people that would like to get the support of the European Hydrogen Bank, they need to actually figure out who is going to buy the stuff. So I do think there is merit in a combination of the two. So, and I think there is talks. The European Hydrogen Bank is expanding. They're actually talking to H2 Global. Perhaps they can also introduce this unlocking, because many people that that have a great project, they do not necessarily have the infrastructure to provide offtake, especially if it's not one big lumpy customer that you may find, but then in the end it's going to be maybe a range of them, and then you have to do all that work. So in a way, I do think that the H2 Global initiative is elegant in that sense, because they decouple that. Now, where does it stand? So far we've seen, basically a little bit of a hesitant emergence of offtake in Europe. Dolf alluded to the fact that, contrary to maybe what we thought a couple of years ago, the costs haven't really gone down to the extent that that makes it easy to set up a business case, even if you factor in a price of carbon. And this is, by the way, something that we always have to consider. 75% of all emissions in the world are unpriced, even though there is a cost to them. Recent Stanford research actually figured out that the social cost of carbon, that is the actual cost that it causes society, is $1,368 per ton. So if you take these kind of numbers, then anything we do is makes sense and should be actually in the money. But since we don't price that in, we're struggling to make a business case. Now, Europe, let's assume that the carbon prices will go up again, and if it's about $100 per ton of CO2, if you then look at ammonia, which you know, as you say, is, you know, most projects are actually looking at ammonia, then that actually is double the amount as a bonus green compared to gray. So then, if you're able to produce, let's say, at a good location in Mauritania, you know, perhaps you can make ammonia for $700 per ton, then you're actually competing with 500 gray if you factor in $100 per ton CO2 emissions. And that makes it, you know, interesting in the sense that even though the ammonia prices currently are low because the natural gas price is lower again, it was, of course, 1,400 right after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and it's been going up and down. Now, longer term gas, there seems to be a big supply of gas coming on the market. So in that sense, you know, LNG futures are low, so it's going to be tough, you know, purely on economics. But I do think that we need to, you know, start thinking about also carbon pricing, also for the countries that are actually producers, so they can also have an internal market. Where do we stand? I think everybody is still looking at Europe. Europe is going ahead. The largest potential consumer of hydrogen in Europe is Germany. The new German government, the German minister is the former head of the Hydrogen Council. In that sense, she knows, the government knows. There was an initial drive towards you know, gas, but I believe that was more political positioning. So right now, you know, the old, let's say, hydrogen story is back on the agenda. And in that sense, I do think you know, there is going to be let's say, a better positioning for hydrogen offtakes in Europe than you know, than many people still think. But we do need a lot of things for that to you know, to actually materialize. There is very little infrastructure. You know, the offtake is still somewhat iffy. People do need to have some support, either a mandate, and those things are also being formulated. You know, the aviation fuel, the transport fuels, Dolf mentioned IMO. All of these things are happening, and then it can actually really go, you know, take off, if you will. And if you look at the numbers, the sustainable aviation fuel market in Europe by 2030, those are large numbers. And if you then translate into projects for exporters, people really need to start building right now, even though people are still hesitant to sign those agreements. If Europe is serious about implementing them, the penalties that the Commission has for not complying with your quota targets are almost double. I think it's $14,000 per ton. The cost is maybe whatever, 7,000. You know, conventional aviation fuel is 700, so it's a factor 10. But then it's a factor 20 for penalty. So people are concerned that you know, this actually needs to happen, and we only have a few more years. So I hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much for sharing all these developments, but also the cost numbers for different markets, and also your views on the short term. With respect to the carbon markets, I won't specifically say carbon price. I think this is essential. I showed one instrument, contract for difference, and generally, you know, in the policy space, it's linked with carbon contract for difference, but it's not a given. A carbon market is needed for that to be operational as a OPEX de-risking instrument, and that's typically overlooked, so, you know, in policy advice and so on. So I think that is definitely a part of the solutions, the carbon markets. I think we've heard some, let's say, short to medium term development opportunities in the hydrogen market, Eleanor. Maybe we can take that up from not only from renewable hydrogen, but to think of from the perspective of renewable energy and renewable hydrogen-derived commodities. And it would be good to understand for, I think, us also your views on the role of trade in creating international markets. And if you have any suggestions on the, let's say, the steps that can be taken towards creating those markets via trade.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. And there we go. That's better. It's on now. Hello everybody. Thank you for having me. So for those that don't know, I'm Eleanor from Mission Innovation. Mission Innovation is a global initiative which came out of COP21 when the Paris Agreement was signed. And global leaders came together and said, this is quite ambitious and there's a lot of innovation questions. So how do we pull together to tackle this? And back in 2015, countries really weren't working together on this. Things like intellectual property was a real barrier. Likes of Obama and India with Modi was a big backer, and we came together and we created Mission Innovation. So here we are, 10 years on, and we have 7 missions, one of which is a hydrogen mission, so quite relevant to this topic. But in terms of the question, so the first question, what can international trade contribute? So I think international trade and international markets are intrinsically linked. So they are completely coupled. Successful trade means a successful international market. And to give a flavour of where I've seen some successful examples, so for example, countries with abundant renewables can export across borders, and this is something that we do within Mission Innovation, such as the ASEAN Power Grid, which builds resilience for the region. And then also cross-sector integration. So this is things like financial and digital services. So in order to have kind of a successful international market, we need to be able to successfully have trade networks on things like digitalization and finance, as well as the commodities. And then in terms of practical next steps, so kind of got 3 examples of things that we work with our members on. So the first is unified standards, and I think that's probably not a surprise to anybody. This can include things like certifications and policies, and an example of that is Europe's guarantees of origin, which is something that we've seen lots of our members interested in trying to replicate within their own regions. The second example is to really start considering, well, not start considering, but consider critical materials, because a lot of the bottlenecks that we see are actually to do with the trade of critical materials for clean energy innovation. And this is extremely complex. So Mission Innovation also works with forums like the G20, like COP, G7, and we are seeing critical materials being discussed in those energy tracks. But of course, it's still it's very geopolitically, it's something that's very topical, and is something that within the next 5 years is definitely things that we need to be working on internationally together to make sure that we can keep successful trade internationally of such important commodities. And then the final thing is to do with financing. We need efficient financial frameworks to enable efficient international trade. And one example I wanted to highlight is the UK export finance, which essentially makes sure that companies that have ideas and want to get things on board to do with clean energy can actually get things out the door quicker. They can get exported, they can be insured. And the UK spent, I believe, 8.8 billion on this in 2023 to 2024. So there are successful financial frameworks out there to help domestically support products getting over the border to sort of really foster this international market. Yes, thank you. I'll finish there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and also for being so specific with examples. I think that's very helpful. Actually, all 3 of you are being so specific by sharing examples. Thank you very much for that. And there was one thing you mentioned on the standards and certification, which was also in my presentation. As you can imagine, at the OECD, we really like the word interoperability, harmonization, these type of issues. And in the case of the standards and certification, as was also highlighted by the previous IRENA work, is an important aspect. And if I may turn to Dolf about that topic, how you see the current situation in the interoperability and what needs to be done there, basically to ensure that standards and certification is a tool for creating the trade of renewable hydrogen.
Well, a first observation related to this international trade is that it's very much a buyer's market at the moment. So basically, the producing countries need to meet the requirements of the importing countries. The regulations are different by importing country, and they are fairly complex. So one of the things we did to facilitate that was develop a European navigator, which is basically a tool that takes you through the different European regulations so you can understand what now exactly is required. And at the moment, we are developing a similar tool also for Japan, which is another major importing country going forward. Let's say in many situations where we're talking kind of a greenfield investment. So if it's a greenfield investment and the hydrogen production project, renewable hydrogen production project, has to also develop its own renewable power and it's standalone, I mean, then you meet all the requirements, right? It gets a little bit shady if you use grid electricity and how you account in such a case if there's also fossil fuels on the grid, which is the case in some of the jurisdictions. But as said, it depends very much on into which market you want to deliver. I would say at the moment, it's not a major barrier for trade. But to give you one example of what is a bit of an issue is if you talk aviation fuels, there was, of course, the efforts by a Fischer-Tropsch producer in South Africa to export into the European market. Fischer-Tropsch gives you a mix of diesel and jet fuel. And the European regulation says you have to allocate your renewable hydrogen input pro rata to these products. Well, the only product where there's a premium is the aviation fuel. So in that case, the regulation acted as a barrier. And discussions about changing that, the Europeans basically said, we're not going to change it. So it would help if there's also a little bit of flexibility on the importing side.
Maybe just one very small follow-up question on this. I think you mentioned various examples also where regulation becomes a barrier. How do you see the role of international cooperation dialogue? Can that help to overcome some of these?
Well, I mean, first of all, the regulations are fairly complex. So just clarifying what is in place, I think, is already very helpful. Then being very specific on what are the main issues for both sides in this context, and then trying to find a solution. But as said, for the time being, it's a buyer's market.
Okay. Frank, please.
Yeah, maybe also, I mean, in terms of, to Dolf's point, it being a buyer's market, the largest, one of the largest buyers is the European Union, and we have here the definition of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which is a very complex thing where, the Europeans try to avoid additional stress on the European grid, which is in the first place, I think, a little bit misguided. And then secondly, you impose that on other countries where maybe they have other problems than with that specific grid issue. So there is a fundamental issue. Now, the other fundamental issue is that it currently doesn't really matter. I mean, even though I think it's bullshit, but the fact is that uncertainty matters. Because this whole talk about maybe we should be a little bit more flexible, maybe we should change, etc., fine, but just do it and then say it and then don't change it. Currently, people are not making investments because there is this talk about maybe we should loosen it up a little bit, etc. Then everything stops because you say, well, if I'm going to build my project now, according to these very strict standards of temporal and geographic correlation, yada, yada, yada. And then later on, they're going to make it a little bit more flexible. You can have a PPA and you can bank some stuff like the Indians do. Then I make an expensive project and I won't be in the market. So I think certainty is at the moment more important than this let's wait and see and maybe reconsider and maybe do it a little bit more flexible.
Thank you, Frank. I have one more question to you. I'll come back to that later because in addition to what Dolf said and what also international dialogue cooperation can do, I want to turn to Eleanor. Also, you know, from a collaborated innovation aspect, what would be the role for renewable hydrogen trade market creation? If you have views on that, that would be
sure.
helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I want to start off with zooming out a little bit and just reflecting on international collaboration generally, because one of the things that we hear a lot is we don't have time really for that, or what's the tangible outcomes and things like this. So I think for me, I'm often asked, why does international cooperation matter, essentially? And I think from a trade perspective, which is what we're talking about here, it's essential really in reducing risks in cross-border markets, because you cannot create a successful cross-border market without speaking to each other. And in many cases, speaking to lots of countries that might border your national boundaries. But ultimately, it promotes trust. So mission innovation, I think, is really important for countries to work together multilaterally in a safe space where bilaterally some conversations couldn't be had. So I think, for one thing, that's super important, particularly as we venture into things like critical materials and all these different aspects which are quite controversial, which relate to trade. But I think I just wanted to highlight kind of 3 examples where I think international collaboration is essential for supporting international trade. So it links to what I was saying earlier about the development of shared standards. So I think the International Partnership for Hydrogen and Fuel Cells in the Economy, which I know is IPHE, that's why I had to read my notes because I can never actually remember what it stands for. But they are a close partner of mission innovation. I think they are extremely effective at tackling some of these quite tricky questions that relate to some of the commodities required for hydrogen innovation. And then, of course, can't not mention the IRENA collaborative framework, which Scott, James and I worked on a little bit at COP last year. So that's something that, again, really reflects on safety codes and trade rules, which are 2 things which are quite difficult to talk about between countries sometimes. So in all these forums kind of create that safe space to tackle some of these questions. The second point is about pooling R&D efforts, because initially that's one of the main reasons mission innovation was established, is because lots of people were doing very similar kinds of research, but deep within their own national research institutions. So what we do through our missions is that we bring those research institutions together, both at the working level, but then also the ministerial level, so that we're kind of reflecting throughout the kind of strategic side of it, but also the technical side of it. And one of the things that we do at our ministerial each year is have dialogues where we can kind of deep dive into some of the key questions related to trade networks relating to things like hydrogen. And these dialogues, whilst on the outset might seem quite high level, are actually really important for fostering those networks between ministers, which ultimately does filter down to the working level. And then the final one is the co-development of infrastructure and supply chains. And it's kind of what I was saying about cross borders, is that it takes the conversation on both sides to be able to do this. And certainly, and it relates to what I was saying about surplus energy. So one of the things that we examine quite closely in mission innovation is the EU-Chile Global Gateway, which is kind of the EU supporting Chile in becoming a hydrogen superpower in order for Chile to be able to trade hydrogen energy, essentially. And this is something that we've seen, again, our country's interested in trying to replicate bilaterally. So I think that international cooperation is essential for finding these kind of networks, for sharing these kind of best examples, and then bringing the ministers together to really deep dive on how this works so that they can create those enabling environments within their own national governments. And I think I'll just end the point because I really liked the harmonisation language, and I think that's something that we use a lot. So I think overall, kind of international collaboration harmonizes the conversation. So you take something that is a product, which is a commodity for hydrogen, and you make it into something tradable through kind of creating these global networks. So international collaboration is absolutely key, which I hope is very on brand for mission innovation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. These are very helpful. At the same time, there are many good questions on the screen. Actually, we've answered, I think, partially the very last one, the trade and finance incentives. But there's a few which go in the direction of value creation, the benefits aspect. So we create the market, we create the trade routes, etc. And I want to understand from you, Frank, your views on the benefits, not only for decarbonization, but socioeconomic benefits, and also the fair sharing of all of those. Because it matters if you export green iron versus green steel, the amount of value you create on the importer and exporter side. So if you can elaborate on those, that would be also helpful.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And a couple of years ago, we started an initiative together with UNIDO about basically the idea was so you have all these potential large-scale investments in growth economies, for to some extent the benefit of Europe. Let's put it bluntly like this. And how do you avoid the pitfalls of the extractive industry? How do you not make it a second mining industry that just comes in, takes the stuff out and sells it? Bribe some politicians and off you go. So we looked at the number of aspects of these investments. You look at water, many places are water scarce, so how do you do that? We looked at labor, we looked at local value creation, etc. We worked together with UNCTAD, which is closely related to the World Trade Organization. We worked with the ILO, the African Development Bank, etc. And then we came up with a set of, let's say, it's difficult to call it requirements, but there were a set of recommendations for each of these topics. That if you're looking at job creation, what kind of jobs are those? How do you provide training? Water, if you have to make water from seawater, water desalination, it's actually not that expensive in the overall cost picture of hydrogen. So why don't you then, let's say, encourage developers to make at least double the amount of water so that you turn it into a solution rather than a problem. So if you have to make a certain amount for hydrogen, ammonia, etc., make double that and you provide water for the community. So those are a list of guidelines that provide a framework for decision making. Many governments, they're landlords, they do auctions for these projects, and then you can say, well, fine, but please look at these guidelines and give us your best proposal. And another way to use these guidelines would be for lenders. If they have to give a substantial amount of money, look at these guidelines and say which ones you like and you don't like, and then you can also provide that as a decision framework, for money to be given to these projects.
Thank you very much for sharing these. I think our time is over, but if there's any other thing the colleagues want to add. Okay, I will be wrapping up together with James at the end of the meeting, so I'll hand over to the moderator. Thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you, Deger. I'd now like to invite to come up to the stage James Walker, who's the team lead for renewable gases at IRENA. He's going to be moderating a fireside chat focusing on new solutions and best practice from real-world developments in next-generation trade.
Thank you very much, Felicia, and thank you to our panelists there for a great first discussion. We're going to continue in that vein, and I'm really delighted to invite up another couple of great speakers to give us some other perspectives on these topics. So Ryan Xiao please join us on the stage. Ryan is Deputy General Manager at the China Hydrogen Alliance Research Institute. And Luca Corradi, who's Chief Technical Officer at the Net Zero Technology Centre. So please join me. So the idea for this is that we're a little bit more cozy, just the three of us. And yes, exactly. And what we're trying to do is build on the discussion we've just heard that's starting at a multilateral policy level and bring in some insights from slightly nearer term development, some projects that your organizations have been involved in and that you're aware of, and see what we can learn. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you if you could introduce yourselves, give us a bit of context for your organizations, tell us about the work you do that has an international market focus, please. So I'll start with you, Ryan, please.
Thank you. Choose me first. Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Xiao from China Hydrogen Alliance. So China Hydrogen Alliance was established in 2018, was under the guidance of the China's administration and commission, for example, the NDRC, NEA, and MOST. They're in charge of the energy reformation and also for the science and technology. And at that time, it was initiated by the China Energy Group, and together with another 19 companies, including state-owned company, universities, and also research institutes, also financial institutes. And it was from the whole value chain, from the production, application, transportation, application. Now it owns 310 members who are the backbone hydrogen of the China hydrogen industry. And for the China Hydrogen Alliance, we are actively support our member to connect with the international and the domestic resources. For example, the China Energy Group, they have been signed many agreements with, for example, the company from the European Union, from Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, and other countries for the cooperation of the projects, for the synergy of the technology, also for the trade of the hydrogen-based green field. We are also actively support the international mechanisms such like China IRENA cooperation. So based on this foundation of cooperation, that we are trying to support and to establish the mutual recognition of the especially for the certification and the standard. So make the hydrogen trade globally possible. Sorry. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. So I'm Luca Corradi, I'm Chief Technology Officer at the Net Zero Technology Center, as James said. But a couple of words about the Net Zero Technology Center is an organization that was set up almost 10 years ago, 9.5. And is industry-led in the sense that we work with industry to define what are the innovation challenges that we need to focus on. And then it is government and industry funded for the work we do in the UK. And it's also industry and funded for the work we do outside of the UK. So we operate internationally as a consultancy, as an advisor to companies and government trying to accelerate to net zero through emerging technology. It's about 70 people. It's based up in Aberdeen, Scotland, which is where I live, although my accent doesn't show off. But our mission is really to accelerate transition to net zero by developing and deploying innovative technology. So we don't have labs, so don't expect a big lab or operation. So we are really the project manager and the project originators of technology innovation projects, led by industry, as I said before, in terms of defining what are the key challenges. So we love technology, basically. We love technology, emerging technology for net zero, and we love to help organization and government to accelerate that. We operate with government, as I said, with industry, with academia, in a very collaborative way. We have about 600 companies that are collaborating with us over the past 10 years. And we've done so far about 400 projects, of which 160 plus are field trials. So we cross the technology readiness level, but our sweet spot really is in that phase of taking something into the water when it comes to the offshore industry, but also into the operations, see if it works, accelerated deployment. So far we have helped 59 technologies get into market. They were not there yet. And and also we run an accelerator for startups. You've seen one a couple of days ago here on stage. We have accelerated so far 117 startups with net zero technology with a survival rate of 90%, which is very, very good, thanks to our collaboration and engagement with industry. International collaboration, international focus. So we are very active internationally, from up there in the north of Scotland. We're part of the Global Climate Action Coalition Task Force. We're a proud member of AFID, the Alliance for Industrial Decarbonization of IRENA, and also of UNISA, the Utilities Net Zero Alliance. We run some collaboration funded completely by industry, one global collaboration on wells plug and abandonment, how to make, for the decommissioning of the oil and gas industry, how to find new technologies that are free of cement, less emitting, but also cheaper in terms of abandoning wells, for example. And another one which is just started on methane emissions in the hard-to-abate sector. And as I said, we also work commercially globally. So we provide services and advisory. We have clients in the US, in the UAE, in East Asia, and also in UK, although UK is more about the government co-funded work. Yeah, and then I think most of the projects that we do, most of the technology that we help accelerate, even if the business case is focused on the UK, they really have an international application. You've seen one a couple of days ago on saltwater electrolyzers. The challenge is common. There's a different way of countries address that, but we all know that the climate change challenge is a common one, and the technology solution travel very fast. I think for our mission and why we're located up there in Aberdeen, that's of course one of the heart of the former oil and gas industry, and there's a fantastic supply chain there, of innovative company, of engineering companies that are very engaging in this transition and developing solutions that also goes beyond oil and gas and actually diversify and progressively transition into the renewables and the clean energy world. That's us in a nutshell.
Great, thank you very much, both of you. Luca, that was, I think, accidentally a very nice segue for me. So you're talking about technology incubation and the development of novel solutions that can apply first in a domestic context and then address an international market by virtue of being successful. That links me to the question I'd like to ask you, Ryan, please. So in the conversation we are having and that we typically have on trade and renewable energy value chains, we very quickly talk about hydrogen, ammonia, methanol as commodities. But actually it's incredibly important that we deal with trade in technology and equipment. And I think we all know that China is an extremely important supplier of those technologies, components, systems across the renewable energy value chains in general. And what I was wondering was whether, if we bring the focus back to hydrogen, if you could give us some thoughts and perspectives from you in the organization and the member organizations about what role China is likely to play in the international market for technologies in the hydrogen realm, please.
Thank you, James. I think, you're talking about the trade of hydrogen. It's not only including the hydrogen itself, methanol, SAF. It's also for the technology transfer, also the equipment. So I think the potential is huge. And the first is that in the past several years that China has made tremendous technology breakthrough. For example, just in last year, there was, I think it's the largest alkaline electrolyzer, 25 megawatts, and also 2.5 megawatts only for single stack PEM electrolyzer has rolled off the production line. And we are also noticed and got information from our remember that there was also a megawatt scale seawater electrolyzers. Also, they will be developed and put into a trial operation. Also, China has trying different, production pathway of hydrogen. For example, that's biomass to hydrogen production, nuclear hydrogen production, as well as quite a new topic about natural hydrogen exploration. So all of these has been researched and developed. And also, talking about equipment, I would say that we noticed that in the past year that the price of the alkaline electrolyzer is notably dropped within $1 million per 5 megawatts. So that's quite an impressive number. And in the transportation sector, there's some 100 kilometer level of hydrogen blending pipeline has also been, commissioned. And the transocean hydrogen transport also be explored. And then I'm talking about the application. So right now in China for the hydrogen applications, they are being in many areas like transportation, I mean the vehicle, and also chemical plants, metallurgy, and the power generation. So according to our latest number, that for the hydrogen refueling station, the number go up to 540. So either they are constructed or they are being put into the operation. For the whole country, there's 24,000 fuel cell vehicles. So this is a contribute not only by its commercial running, but also by a national policy. We call it fuel cell vehicle city cluster policy. It contributes almost 15,000 vehicles. Most of them are heavy-duty truck. Okay, there was also examples that the hydrogen coupled with chemical plants. It was China Energy Group, the Ningdong Renewable Hydrogen Project. So this project was fully connect the power to hydrogen and later on to the ammonia by replacing the coal-based hydrogen using the renewable hydrogen, which was generated by the photovoltaic power. And there were several hydrogen metallurgy demonstration projects in Hebei, Shandong province has also now in operation. So besides that, there are also export of service. So we know that there's some we call it, there's two very giant construction company. We call the China Energy Engineering Corporation and also Power China. They have gained extensive experience all over the world for the renewable power plants. And now they using this experience to participate in the development of large-scale renewable hydrogen and the derivatives production basis. So I think within the equipment and within the experience of this construction, China is aimed to drive down the cost and to enhance the international cooperation. And last but not for the least is for the trade-off opportunity, I think is emerging. You know that China now possesses the largest renewable installation. And also in many regions, we have abundant renewable resources. So this is laying a solid foundation for us to move downstream to the low-cost green hydrogen production. So according to our statistic, there have been already 600 renewable projects. Altogether, producing the capacity is 125,000 tons per year. And in this rich renewable region, for example, the Northwest China, Northern China, and Northeast China, we are able to make the cost down to $3 per kilogram at the boundary of the production facility. And for China Hydrogen Alliance, we are promoting, we call it IH100, Renewable Hydrogen 100 Gigawatt Initiative, that we analyze China has the potential and the capability and also the willingness to install 100 gigawatt electrolyzers by 2030. So this, I think in summary, we are confident that China will make positive contribution to the development of the global hydrogen economy and also the energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. That's very helpful and insightful and exciting in many ways. There are a lot of big numbers there. So, Luca, I'd like to fall into the pattern that I've set for myself in terms of focusing now on commodity trade. And I know personally about some work that the Net Zero Technology Centre have undertaken, looking in particular at the opportunities to potentially, let's say, export hydrogen produced from offshore wind in the north of Scotland, where there's a lot of wind, as you know, here to Germany, where there's a strong industrial demand, as has already been mentioned before. And I think our audience would join me in being interested in hearing from you about what the centre has learned there and what some of the insights from the feasibility studies that have been undertaken might show us, and the insights that are transferable to other geographies as well, perhaps. Please.
Absolutely, yeah. So on hydrogen, our focus is on we call it make it, move it, store it. You know, it sounds a bit like a song, if you want, but it helps focus in us. And on the move it, I think the question is the matter that we heard in the previous panel as well, is how do you connect the supply and demand? And we have an interesting situation, as you said. Scotland has probably the best wind resources. Not probably, it has the best wind resources of all Europe, and a big part of that. It is a small population. Yeah. The recent ScotWind licensing for offshore wind production has a potential to generate 50 gigawatt. The current network can only take 5 down to UK, to the rest of UK where the demand is. Of course, there's work to be done in the infrastructure, but still there's a lot of potential of how do we take that wind power from where it can be produced cheaply and in big size to where it's needed. And the European Union focus on having 10% of import of hydrogen, especially the demand in Europe, triggered that question about how do we transport that. And of course, we look at a variety of transport solutions from liquid organic hydrogen carriers to ammonia. But the cheapest way to transport something from point to point, if you have a point-to-point, is a pipeline. And of course, we know something about pipelines in that part of the world. And so the study that we started, the techno-economic study that we started a couple of years ago, which is funded initially by the Scottish government, but also with strategic partners like the National Grid, SGN, Enquest, and Kellas Partner, which is a pipeline operator. And then it's done, as I said, in collaboration with a number of companies. Let me just mention a couple of them: Exodus, DNV, GL, Wood Mackenzie, and Worley. So it's a series of studies, very comprehensive, looking at the techno-economic feasibility of taking hydrogen from the northeast of Scotland to Emden in Germany by 2035 through a pipeline. So we look at different options. One was about recycling, reusing gas pipeline. There's a lot of gas pipes in the North Sea. And although technically feasible, it was very complicated from also on a time perspective, because we needed that project to be able to be constructed, to be in place when there is demand and supply in place. And the gas industry is decommissioning, but not completely. So you have that uncertainty on which pipeline will be available when. In addition, there is also a need to build the new pipelines in between to connect some of that. So it turns out that the best and cheapest solution is a new gas pipeline, a new hydrogen pipeline from the northeast of Scotland to Germany. It also gives the opportunity to think ahead and make it future-proof, like a digital-enabled pipeline, with sensors and AI, whatever, in order to make sure that the amount of is automated as much as possible. So what have we learned? I think the first thing we learned is I prefer to have a purpose-built pipeline that recycles. Although we like the idea to reuse it as much as we can, that makes little sense compared to the other options. For the need for rapid deployment and the technical complexity, as I said. Then there is a cost, of course, and the cost is interesting because the estimated capex to develop this pipeline is about £2.7 billion, so 3 billion euros, more or less. That would give us a transport tariff of about 32 pence per kilo. And an initial investor return about 6%, taking 90% utilization. That 32p per kilo makes Scottish hydrogen very competitive with the hydrogen from Chile, we heard, or from the Middle East, when it takes in account the transportation cost and therefore the cost at consumer or at the receiving end, which, and the proximity also to Europe that it has, which could be in the region of, it's difficult to say because it depends on the cost of producing it and so forth, but it could potentially be on the $3 to $4 dollars or euros. So that's the one. And the second learning is, of course, from a technology center for us is about, do we have the technology? Can we do it? How quickly can you do it? Is everything ready and tested? Because when you hear, as a general term, when you hear about net zero technology, everybody in the past few years, especially at COP, saying, oh, the technology is there, we just need to finance it. I argue that the technology is there, but not at the price point. We heard the premium before, right? So to make the technology at price, at scale, some innovation or some development still needs to be done. But in this case, most of the required technology is actually mature and available to build this pipeline, with a couple of points where we think there's a need for further investment in R&D and testing. And one is in compressor technology at that scale. We're talking about 10 gigawatt scale for this pipeline. Is about meter, hydrogen meter and valve test. We do have hydrogen valve, hydrogen meter, but they're used for small scale application at the moment. This is a different scale. And then the large scale hydrogen solution, because you need to keep the pressure on and make sure that you can store this hydrogen when there's a lot of wind and you have a massive production, and when you don't have it, then you need to fill the pipeline at the same time. So those are the kind of 3 elements where we think there's still a need to be do a bit of technology. Also, when it comes to testing, we haven't really tested this thing with the hydrogen. We use nitrogen or nitrogen blended most of the cases. And so when you embark on a similar scale and similar thing, with operators are comfortable having testing with nitrogen before actually pumping in the hydrogen, or do we need to do a little bit of verification? So probably some food for thought on that. And then when it comes to impact, as I said, the hydrogen backbone link, or the HBL, this is the name of the project, maybe I should have mentioned from the beginning. But the hydrogen backbone link, we start from the idea that, of course, you're probably familiar with the European hydrogen backbone. And when we look at that a few years ago, say, oh, where's the link to the UK here? Where's the link to Scotland? There isn't a link. So let's create this project, hydrogen backbone link, so we can connect on that market. But this backbone link could supply probably 10% of the European Union projected hydrogen import demand by the mid-2030. And of course, in Scotland, it can support up to 700 jobs initially and enable probably 300,000 jobs, clean jobs in Scotland by 2035. This is a big number. I'm always hesitant with numbers. We're sitting next to China, because China has another magnitude differently, but this is still important numbers for the UK and for the EU. So that's in a nutshell is the project and what we learned. There's a phase 2 now. We're looking at, because we talk about bilateral here, and there's a link Scotland to Germany. But actually, a lot of value comes when you can expand the bilateral into a multilateral. So phase 2 is looking at a number of things for routes. One is the connection of the link to the aqueduct pipeline system. And the other one is Ireland, because Ireland also has a big potential for wind, and therefore there's a potential to connect the East Irish Sea through Scotland and then to this link and create a wider market. This phase 2 has partners like the Port of Rotterdam as well, or ESB, so is potentially become more of a network rather than a point-to-point. Before we start producing. But the phase 2 also is looking very much into the regulatory elements as well. We heard before, so not an expert on that, won't go into the details, but there's a need to have to address that challenge of cross-border transport and transmission. And I stop here because I've seen a signal that maybe I'm talking too much.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure about talking too much, but I have to say I have 2 more questions of my own. There are many questions on the screen. We won't have time to get through them, but we have a coffee break, so let's take advantage of asking the speakers some more questions hereafter, because I think we're just scratching the surface on some really exciting insights from the different areas you're working in. So thank you very much for sharing that with us and joining us. And we're moving now into some closing remarks from Deger and I. So thank you again. preference for how shall I go and then you go? We haven't specifically decided how to choreograph this part, so we're improvising a little. My reflection started very early in the session when Ann-Kathrin mentioned that the energy transition will change trade patterns, but that the evolution of trade will also shape the transition. And this is a theme of a hopefully virtuous cycle that's come through the conference, where, for example, we're talking about digitalization influencing and powering the transition, but also vice versa. So that for me was a very nice starting point. It's also very clear to me that when we discuss international trade in renewable energy value chains, it very quickly becomes a conversation about hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, no matter what way you try to take the conversation. But I really appreciate the insights we had from the panel on technology trade and some of the aspects Eleanor mentioned that are cross-cutting at the international level, thinking about how we continue to develop and embed robust, resilient supply and value chains across different technologies. We then also had a really detailed and I think very helpful conversation, Deger, with the panelists concerning some of the status of hydrogen projects and relevant regulatory frameworks, some of the considerations for de-risking international projects. And maybe I pause there and see what you think.
No, thank you. But first of all, thank you to your team and IRENA for co-organizing this with the OECD. That's, I think, very much appreciated. And it was both excellent discussions in my view. To summarize a few things of what we've heard, I think in the trade part, there are promising developments, some early stage, some more advanced, but good examples that can be shared. Offtake remains important, but it's very project specific, the context, you know, the durations, the volume of the contract, but also what type of structures and de-risking financing instruments are used there. And so that needs to be understood better for the successful ones and how they can be replicated. But we've also heard something very important, the regulatory aspect. So it's not only an offtake risk, it's also other risks that are emerging, and regulation is key to strengthen, improve. Also in the context of the standards and certification, which is an essential issue in the, for creating trade and markets. And there, I think the setting of the power, energy, raw material supply, depending on how you view it, but also the value chain definition of the hydrogen and its derivatives are key, and that determines the importance of standard certification in various markets where hydrogen is being used. I think we've also discussed a very important issue that's more in the context of sustainable development, sustainability, the benefits of these markets. So especially considering from the exporting countries, regions, it's not only creating the trade revenue, but it's also creating jobs, also considering land, water-related impacts. So for both the exporting and importing country regions to create both decarbonization and sustainability benefits. And finally, international cooperation came as a very important aspect. At the same time, I heard so many examples of that during the panel, so thanks to Eleanor for that. But that means it's also a very crowded space. And I think we need to see how to coordinate all that international efforts that are emerging to make the best and most effective use of them in the context of trade. Thank you again for James, and thanks to everyone for listening. Please.
Thank you, Deger. I had like two more points just to finalize then. So I agree that international collaboration extending into international coordination is really where we need to focus efforts. So there was quite a lot of discussion on the panel around the measures required to enable further investment, enable further projects in these areas. We had good examples around the need for harmonized and interoperable standards and certification. There was also discussion around the use of trade policy and trade rules and regulatory frameworks to set expectations on the either side of the import-export dynamic. And then we had some applied examples of where that's helping to shape up projects, which I think is very helpful. I wanted to close by thanking you, Deger, very much. So it's been very nice co-organising with the OECD and bringing the two perspectives, looking at the questions from slightly different angles, thinking about financing and offtake and de-risking, and our work with WTO on the trade rules side. I think that makes quite a nice, neat puzzle, if I do say so myself. But for me, the conclusion and the key takeaway is definitely basically quoting Eleanor around international collaboration as an important plank or an important mechanism for building confidence, improving the investment conditions, bringing producers and consumers together to discuss requirements and expectations, and just working together to understand each other better so that we form markets that suit all of our needs internationally and globally. And in the context of IRENA Innovation Week, it's a very nice place to close the session, to say thank you to everyone who's contributed to shaping that picture and helping us better understand what the priorities are for international collaboration. And here's to the further work together. Thank you.
Thank you to all our speakers this morning, and I'm going to echo what James said. It's wonderful to actually listen to something where you are hearing people talk about international collaboration, because that's how we achieve change. But on that note, I will let you all run away for coffee. So if you could all be back here for 11:30, sorry, that would make it an hour, at 11 a.m. We've got 2 parallel sessions. There's project facilitation in fragile countries in Camaha Grande, and we'll be looking at the infrastructure for sustainable fuels. So if you could come back at 11. One final note, you will see this floating around in various places during coffee. If you would be kind enough to have a look at it and complete the survey, it's really useful for us to identify what's worked for you, what hasn't, what you'd like to know about, what you thought was good, what you'd like to see. So if you could do that. Oh, sorry, I thought Ann-Kathrin was waving at me, but she was just pulling a wire. All right, I'll see you all at 11.